When I kind of joined Herb, you were beginning to pray for something. I don't know what it was. But it took me to a passage in Exodus chapter 2, because you were praying that God would see and hear. And in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, it says, the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. And here's the sequence of verbs. God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant, so he remembered his commitments. And then it says, so God looked on the Israelites and was concerned. I mean, so you're seeing he hears, he sees, he feels in, their groaning and remembers, his commitments. And so I think those are key factors for all of this Matthew 25 to remember that. Okay, so this is the next to last meeting. The last meeting will be in May, not October, May. I'm tired. But what I thought I'd do tonight, next time, the last time, I might just kind of rehearse where we've been. Maybe that'll be helpful. But tonight, what I want to do, and let me do this screen share thing. What I want to do is, okay, let me see if I can do this properly. Okay. What I want to do is focus on a particular prophetic book that I've mentioned before, but tonight I thought we'd kind of go through it a little bit more in detail and just see the breadth of things that the prophet points out. And I think because Matthew 25 has such a breadth of ministries and concerns, that it might be helpful. And so this is our 14th study. And what I want to do is focus on the book of Micah. So if people have a Bible, I would ask them to go to the book of Micah. And I'll just start listing some verses. And I will go for a while, and then I'll stop and see if there's any questions or comments, and then I'll continue. But if people are in Micah, what I want to do is begin with chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. And I want you to listen to the different kinds of injustice and how they work. Woe to those who plan iniquity, to those who plot evil on their beds, and at morning's light they carry it out because it is in their power to do so. That's a great line where you have people plotting, even at night, how to acquire things and to take advantage of vulnerable people. But that key line, because it is in their power to do so. And so then what we're seeing is just the injustice and the manipulation of power for personal gain, greed. They covet fields and they seize them, and houses and they take them. They defraud a man of his home, a fellow man of his inheritance. So no concern at all for the cost of what they're doing. It's all about greed. Now, I want you to watch the play here because in verse 1, they plot evil. And then you look in verse 3, therefore the Lord says, I am plotting against this people. So they plot, well, he'll plot against them. So you're seeing how it all comes back on them. I am planning disaster, or I am plotting against this people for which you cannot save yourselves. You will no longer walk proudly, for it will be a time of calamity. So not only greed but it's also arrogance because they have the power to do whatever they want and no one calls them to account. But we're seeing that what they plot, God will plot in reverse. And here's how they respond. And again, this is something out of the newspaper. In that day, men will ridicule you. They will taunt you. So when things get turned on their head, when they begin to lose because of what God does, what they had taken, and now they're being shamed, they will say, we are utterly ruined. My people's possession is divided up. He, meaning Yahweh, he takes it from me. He assigns our fields to traitors. So, they're happy to take things, but when the tables are turned, they see it as injustice against them. See, even though they are the ones who precipitated all of it, even though they're the ones that are causing all the problems, when it happens to them, now they're the victims. Okay? That's something out of the newspaper or the internet now, I guess we'd say. And then what you have, I mean, it just shows you how sick, ancient Judah was, but we live in a very sick society too. So what's going on in this kind of society of all this inequality and vulnerability? Do not prophesy, their prophets say. Do not prophesy about those things. Disgrace will not overtake us. Should it be said, O house of Jacob, is the spirit of Yahweh or the Lord angry? Does he do such things? You see, they don't want an angry God. Does God do nasty things? No. Do not my words do good for those whose ways are upright? So they don't want to hear, a hard message. And the response is, God would never do this. God's not a violent God. God's not a nasty God. And so they never preach judgment. They never hold people to account. And then when you drop down to verse 11, here it is. If a liar and deceiver comes and says, I will prophesy for you plenty of wine and beer, he would be just the prophet for this people. And so, it's not only, health and wealth gospel here, it's also those who minister to the powerful and the wealthy and never question them, never hold them to account. And they're not preaching health and wealth, but they're preaching status quo because they earn a living doing this. See? I'll prophesy for you. See? That's what you want to hear. And they get paid for this. And so they're never going to question those in power. And as we move into an election season, of course, you see this a lot where you'll have pastors lining up behind either party, doing the photo ops, speaking for their respective parties, never questioning, promising all kinds of things, because that's what the people want to hear. So it's not only a sick society where greed and power manipulate things, but also a religious system that is so compromised and so co-opted that they don't question anything either. Now let's go to chapter 3. There's a lot more here, but again, we'll see how all this is intertwined. Then I said, listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel. Now, these are the political, socioeconomic leaders. Should you not know justice? You who hate good and love evil? Who tear the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones? Who eat my people's flesh, strip off their skin, and break their bones in pieces? Who chop them up like meat for the pan, like flesh for the pot? And again, what you're seeing is they're plotting, they're plotting evil. They hate the good. It's all about greed and envy. And I may have used this passage before, but let me repeat what I've taught this, to the students. I use this illustration, and maybe people can get a sense of the power of the metaphor. When it's Thanksgiving, you have the turkey, right? And so after the meal, my wife will debone the turkey, which is a kind of grotesque exercise. It's very messy, but she's pulling the bone off, pulling the meat off the bone. And so that's why for several days you'll have turkey soup, turkey sandwiches, turkey casserole. But this is what you're seeing here. You see that they're taking the meat off the bones, and they're putting it, into the pot. And so this metaphor of how they're actually consuming the vulnerable people around them. And I would think that those who work with certain vulnerable populations, you've actually seen this happen, where people are consuming them and using them and manipulating them for their own gain. Then they will cry out to the Lord. I mean, these are religious people, but he won't answer them. And at that time, he will hide his face from them because of the evil they have done. There are consequences before God for doing these kinds of things. Your prayers go unheard, and he will turn his face from you, even though they're very religious people. So put this together with chapter 2. They have their prophets, and we'll see a bit later. They have their priests, they have their preachers who will give them what they want, but what they will not get is an ear from God. And this is, you can see the contrast, in Exodus chapter 2. Who are the ones that God will listen to? Will be the vulnerable people. Those are the ones he will see, and those are the ones he will hear, and those are the ones he will be concerned about. He goes on. This is what the Lord says. As for the prophets who lead my people astray, if one feeds them, they proclaim peace. See, they're happy to do what you want if you pay them. If he doesn't, they prepare to wage war against him. So if you don't pay me, then, they come after them. And therefore night will come over you without visions, and darkness without divination. The sun will set for these prophets, and the day will go dark for them. Kind of a ironic coincidence that we're talking about an eclipse. The seers will be ashamed, the diviners disgraced. They will cover their faces because there is no answer from God. So again, the religious and the socioeconomic and political construct all working together for selfish ends. Those who are in power are taking property and manipulating and consuming. The religious leaders are consuming in their own way, performing, I think that's the proper word, performing for those who have power. If you go to verse 9, hear this, you leaders of the house of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel, who despise justice and distort all that is right. Takes you back to the opening 2 verses of the chapter, where they hate the good and they don't know justice. And here they despise justice and distort it. Who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with wickedness. This is how things work on the blood and on the backs of other people. Her leaders judge for a bribe. Her priests teach for a price. Her prophets tell fortunes for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us. And therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the Temple Hill a mound overgrown with thickets. So, one of the things I've harped on in all these meetings with the prophets is how religion is inseparable from the socioeconomic and political realities of the people of God. Yeah, I mean, I think we could all wax eloquent on that in these last couple of elections. But it goes back many, many centuries ago. I mean, if you go to the ancient world, religion was inseparable from the politics. The empires had their gods that would, go with them into conquest. You look at the history But in the Gospels, Jesus is hitting at this too, and then the history of the church is full of this kind of stuff. I'm reading a book at night before I go to bed, and it's about what the British would call the dissenters, and these were people in the mid 1600s who were speaking out against the Church of England and against the Catholic Church for all the corruption and politics in how they all were intertwined with the English crown. And some of them were being put in prison, some were being executed. Some couldn't even bury their dead in church cemeteries. They'd have to find burial plots outside of London because they weren't even allowed to bury their dead. So this idea of co-optation and of selling their souls for a political project is nothing new. So maybe we can stop here for just a second. I'd like to hear if there's anyone out there, I know there's a few, who might want to make a comment or maybe share an experience about this.
Herb was thinking about some of our conversations in the past, but I had three just quick observations, and one of them relates to what Herb's talked about before. But first, as you read through these passages, I kept thinking, in order to justify this kind of behavior, you have to dehumanize others. You have to somehow see them as less than. And just a reminder of our times and the language that's being used about immigrants that are coming, and the rhetoric that's dehumanizing is powerful. The second thought category that I thought of application in Matthew 25 world, that even today, when we met with the practitioners, which was before this hour, legal help is so expensive. So when injustice is done, and even if our laws are good and let's say it, we could make the argument that our North American justice system isn't broken, that it's fair. To access it requires a lot of money, and it's happening all over the place in Matthew 25 work. And then the third category, and Herb, maybe you can speak to it more, but it just recently with one of our Matthew 25 leaders just bringing home that there are slumlords still. And so these descriptions in chapter 2 and 3 of the financial gain and the greed and the profiting on the poor, when we talk about homelessness or home insecurity, housing insecurity, many times people who don't struggle with it think kind of like shelter or chronically homeless, but there's a whole spectrum of housing that's unstable, housing that's not safe, and then there are those that profiteer off of that. So those are my three quick comments. Herb, your experience with, code slumlords, doesn't it feel like it's present?
No, it feels like this. There's next to our shop back up in Pennsylvania, there's an apartment complex. I think it has 150 apartments, and one of our staff members at our shop back in PA lived there, and for 2 years there was a hole. There had been some damage, water damage at one point in her bathroom, and they took some of the drywall out and never replaced it. And so there she has this bare holes, just open, exposed, piping, which has access to other people's apartments for 2 years. And messages about it. She wasn't the only one, and we ended up having a rally on the steps of the mayor's office, just right outside, and the news showed up, and she had eventually moved because that did not stay the hand, or it wasn't enough of a drive to get the owners to do something different about the place. And so there's another they own two buildings. The other one, I was having a conversation with someone outside, and we were talking about, he pointed to the building and said, those people, and very much in a dehumanizing way. And I said, those people, using his word, I said, those people did not say, hey, you know what, when I wake up one day, when I grow up, I want to live in an apartment complex where I have to walk through urine stained hallways to take my kids to school. That was not their dream. So while you're saying those people are stuck. And so you have two options. You can continue to dehumanize them, or you can see that they also have dreams and aspirations, and you can use your connections to actually help them achieve their dreams and aspirations. Those are your two options. But I'm not going to stand here and continue to hear you dehumanize them. Anyway, that was one. The other thing I was thinking about, just real quick, we talk about dehumanizing, and the other side of that, I think, is also true. The work that we do, because our noses are oftentimes down in, and so we would see those who are rich, and we can also dehumanize them, and we can call them cake eaters. That's one of the terms that we use for people who are wealthy. Oh, the cake eaters, they don't know. Well, they're struggling as well, right? They're stuck as well. And even these people who are abusers, they're stuck, because once you get in a system that you profit from, to then stop doing that means you're erasing your community. You've built something, and now you're saying all of these things are propping up your value of who you are, and they're stuck as well. And so my heart recently, over the past 5 years, has begun to break for the wealthy abusers, not excusing them, but my heart breaks because they're stuck. And then unless someone interrupts that narrative and interrupts that thought process, they'll continue thinking that they're right. Anyway.
Yeah, there's several things here, Herb. One of the things that I appreciate about the Old Testament is just how realistic it is. And then at chapter 2 line about because they have the power to do so, there's power differentials going on here. And the Old Testament's not blind to that. There are some who have power and those who don't. And then what we find is it's attitudes. They hate justice. They hate the good. And then you've got the religious people, who are in cahoots with them or have kind of sold themselves. And, they are stuck, but they're also, biblically, they're self-condemned. So they're stuck, but they're also self-destructive. And not only are they destroying other lives, sooner or later, their own lives. Well, because their own families will fall apart, or they'll lose all their money on a scheme, or nothing can protect them ultimately from dying. These are not pretty pictures, but they're true. One of the things that people will say is the Bible true? And oftentimes when people say that, what they are thinking about, is it historically accurate? Well, that's a good question. But there's another way of how the Bible is true, and it in the sense that it is very true to life. And I think this is what we're seeing here. It's very true. I mean, we see all these things going on, thousands of years later. Humanity hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the contrast with the prophet in 3:8, in contrast to the other prophets, he says, "But as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin." So they are self-deceived, self-destructive. God has shut them off. But even though the prophet stands alone, he alone has power because the Spirit of God resides upon him. Now, in the ancient world, before Pentecost, it wasn't like today where the Spirit comes and resides in us. There the Spirit would come and go in the Old Testament. It would come upon a king and leave, a prophet and leave. And you'll see this in Psalm 51, where David will say, "Please don't take your spirit from me." I mean, he recognizes that this is not, to use New Testament language, there is no sealing of the Spirit. So this is something we have that even the prophets didn't have, was we can have the assurance that the Spirit dwells within us. And it will require us to speak up. Like you were saying, Herb, about what you did on the steps of the city. Yeah, I also like that because I've seen this too, where we saw this in chapter 2, where if the tables are turned, now they become the victims, right? Which is just ironic because they're not the victims at all. But I mean, that's how they will perceive it. Okay, let's keep on going. We've talked about these things before, and we actually looked at these passages before, but I thought because we're in Micah, we'd rehearse it again. But if you go to chapter 5, verse 12, "I will destroy your witchcrafts, and you will no longer cast spells. I will destroy your carved images and your sacred stones from among you. You will no longer bow down to the work of your hands. I will uproot from among you your Asherah poles and demolish your cities. I will take vengeance and anger and wrath upon the nations that have not obeyed me." So what we're seeing is in Judah a lot of what we would call syncretism. If you were to stop the person on the street and say, "Do you believe in Yahweh? Do you believe in the Lord?" The answer would be yes. Well, is that the only God you believe in? Well, obviously not. And then the next question, which is the hard question, is what is your God like? I mean, because they may give you the right name. It's like, do you believe in Jesus? Oh, I believe in Jesus. Well, you haven't really told me much. Because the key will be, well, tell me about your Jesus. And so what we do is we craft Jesus to fit our own personal pace. And you can see this is inescapably human. But that's one of the reasons why you have so many denominations. People will fashion worship around what their personalities are like or what their personal needs are. So, some people will be contemplative, others not. They're just not wired that way. Or some will be very activist, others will not. They're just not wired that way. So you'll tend to gravitate toward churches that kind of fit your ethos. And one size does not fit all. Okay? So, but having said that, those different expressions can still be faithful, even if they have different emphases. They still can be faithful, or not. See, so I'll give you an example. So we used to live in Denver. So the old campus of the seminary was at a corner. In cat corner to the seminary, there was this First Nazarene Church of Denver. Okay, typical Nazarene, good-sized church. for a couple of years when I was there, we actually had graduation inside because the auditorium was so big. Well, if you go down maybe 100 yards as you're heading toward I-25, the First Nazarene Church on your right, on your left was First Unitarian Universalist Church. And I used to loved reading the marquee. And one time I remember, the marquee said, "A river runs through us." So I'm going, okay, all right, a little cosmic. You went a little bit further on the right-hand side, there was Bethany Lutheran Church, classic, mainline Lutheran. If you went to the stoplight and took a right around the bend, there was a community church. If you got back on that road and went across the highway, on your left, there'd be American Baptist Church. So this is all within maybe a mile and a half. So if, an alien beamed down from the sky, how many Jesuses would that alien encounter as he walked down that road? Which one would actually be a reflection of the real Jesus? Well, I don't think any church gets it totally right. I mean, that's impossible because if we're just humans. But there's gradations there, right? And so one of the things that we see in the Bible is that we worship ourselves. We create a God in our image, and then we worship that God. We sing songs to the one we've created. We give money to the one we've created. We go to seminars and hear more about the one we've created. And we stay in our silo, and it's a loop, right? And this is one of the dangers, with our own forms of idolatry. Now, here's another thing. I'm just kind of giving you some Old Testament flavor here. So what you find in the Old Testament is, in the ancient world, the gods just looked like us. I mean, they were just kind of superhumans. I mean, the easy one that people would know would be the Greeks, right? The Greek gods look just like us. That's very common in the ancient world. Well, it's also, us. We may not have a bunch of gods. We just have one God, but that God looks like us, right? And that God will be interested in the things we're interested in and not interested in the things that we're not interested in. I mean, so it wouldn't be surprising that if you're in a church that doesn't really care about social things, well, that God doesn't really care about those things either. So that's just common. But the other thing that you find, that I find, and this is the real tricky one, and we'll get to this in just a moment in chapter 6, is that I hear this all the time. Well, don't make your job your idol, right? Or don't make your money an idol, or your car or something. But I would say they're not my idol. I mean, they can be my obsession, but I actually don't worship those things. I don't kneel in front of them. Okay. Now I might give my heart and mind to them, but I'm not worshiping them. The idol is the God of the church you go to that somehow permits this stuff. It never questions the stuff, and maybe even encourages that. See, so that's the idol. It's the false god of the church, the false god of the seminars and the songs, and that's the false god. That's the idol, and that's really the hardest idol to somehow change or even get rid of, because people are invested financially and emotionally in all kinds of ways in that idol, whom they call Jesus or God the Father. And the prophets just won't have anything of it. And you know what you find in the book of Ezekiel, which we won't be looking at, is that eventually God will just tear the temple down. He says, just we're done. And even in the book of Malachi, in chapter 1, I think it's verse 11, where God will say, well, someone just closed the doors of the temple. See, just shut it down. So here he's attacking their idolatry. So let's go to chapter 6. In chapter 6, he says, listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead your case before the mountains. Now, what you have in Old Testament studies here, it's kind of a lawsuit that God brings. And when you have a lawsuit, you need witnesses and you need evidence. And then you need a judge. And then you need a sentence. So you're going to find all of that here. So beginning in verse 1, you begin to see that it's a call to witnesses. Plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. So the witnesses to the trial are nature itself. Okay, so you can't get bigger and more stable witnesses than nature itself. And so now he brings this forward. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. So the lawsuit is beginning. Now the evidence. My people, what? And I want you to look at a word, and it'll depend on your translation, but I'm using the NIV. NIV does a good job here. Where in verse 6, listen to what the Lord says. Verse 3, my people, what have I done to you? And literally, my NIV says, how have I burdened you? It actually says, what have I burdened you with? So, what have I done? What have I burdened you with? I brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, and also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. So it's what? Let me tell you what. And the evidence is the series of whats. Okay? What I've done, what I've done, what I've done. Okay, now what happens is the accused now responds. And look how they respond. With what? Okay, there's that word again. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? So far sounds good, but you have to put on your Old Testament hat. Now, what happens with this passage is the following. He's going to list a series of offerings. And because we tend to be Protestants, we will say, for instance, he'll say, shall I come before him with burnt offerings? The good Protestant in me will say, no. Okay. With calves a year old? No. I mean, that's kind of the Protestant response. That's not an ancient response. What's the problem? The God is angry. In the ancient world, how do you appease the angry God? You bring him stuff, or you bring her stuff, right? And the more, the better. The more expensive, the better. Surely this will appease the God. So when he says, with what shall I come? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? The answer would probably be, yeah, that'd probably be a good idea. With calves a year old, yeah, those were kind of expensive. Yeah, that's good. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? The Protestant will go what? No, God wants you to worship with your heart. I mean, this is the kind of thing you hear in Protestant circles. But in the ancient world, would the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? What would people say? Oh my gosh, yes. This is like Solomon dedicating the temple. Of course, God would be pleased with this kind of stuff. What about 10,000 rivers of oil? Oh my gosh, that's even more. The answer would be yes, yes, yes. But then you get the next one, and now it forces you to stop. Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression and the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Now you're moving into child sacrifice. And that's explicitly condemned. And now you're moving into, you've crossed a line here. And now you have to rethink all those previous questions. Whereas previously you would just say yes every time. Now you just go, oh my gosh, I don't know. This doesn't sound right. And now look at the response. He has shown you what? Okay? With what shall I come? He's shown you what? Okay. You see, the word keeps popping up. Okay. What shall I come with? Well, let me tell you what he wants. He will tell you what is good. And what does the Lord require? Why that word? Because in their minds, they're trying to appease an angry God. What does the God require to change his mind? Well, he requires to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with him. So it's not about bringing stuff, but it's about acting. It's about creating a social world. And this isn't about, inner feelings, though that's going to be part of it. This is very active. This is very concrete. To act justly. I mean, where? In the social sphere. We've been reading over all these chapters, all the abuse of the vulnerable. You have to understand act justly in light of what's come before. And to love mercy instead of, deboning the weak, right? You're to love mercy, not to love their property and not to love what they own, but to love mercy. And that's talking about how you treat other people and to walk humbly instead of the arrogance that we've seen over and over again, the arrogance of the wealthy and the powerful who think they're untouchable, who even have the political leaders and the religious leaders in their back pocket, who think of themselves as untouchable and indestructible. No, you see. So that line where, we have choruses about this, right? That I've heard, the Matthew 6:8 chorus. And, everyone gets kind of weepy and, all this kind of stuff, which I can appreciate. But you have to understand that verse in light of everything that's come before. And now you begin to see, no, these are actionable items. These are concrete demands of God. Not about bringing, but actually creating a different kind of world in which they're to live. Any comments about that?
I mean, I have comments.
Yes.
I have two things. One, going back to this kind of the rich needing, as I'm listening to this, and maybe it's my lens. I mean, obviously it's my lens. But it sounds like there's this passage and God disciplines those he loves, right? And so here he is kind of like Jonah going to Nineveh. These people were off their rockers doing the most, right? And we have Micah. Does that translate? Anyway, and then we have Micah coming in and saying, "Hey, what you're doing is ultimately offensive to God. The very activities you're doing are offensive to God. And what you're saying is they're like, okay, we understand what we're doing is offensive. How do we make it right? Because we recognize that we're wrong. Like they're starting to hear Micah at some point,
I don't
and they're
think
like,
so. I don't think they know that they're wrong. I don't think, and sorry to interrupt you, Herb.
no, okay,
Okay, I think they're trying
to appease
to
God.
yeah, they're trying to appease God because they're trying to justify themselves.
Oh,
They
okay,
don't see, otherwise the prophet wouldn't be so angry. And the
yeah,
prophet wouldn't be going over and over again because it doesn't stop here. I mean, you go to verse 9 and he's back to condemn. Okay. So I don't think, they're beginning to see this about God, and we'll see this in chapters later on in chapter 6 and in 7. This society is so far gone, they just don't see it.
Mm.
And
Which brings me
instead,
to my second point, real quick,
okay,
was Matthew 6:22. He says that the light in you is dark.
yes.
How great that darkness really is. And so if they believe that they're not wrong,
Mhm.
and they end up doubling down, right? Which is again what we're seeing around the world. I have friends who have listened to prophets who have said certain air quotes on prophets, mind you, make sure I'm clarifying air quotes on prophets who have said, oh, this guy is the man. He is sent from God to do XYZ. He will be in power. And I mean, clearly, the Old Testament says, and I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it says if someone prophesies and their prophecy does not come true, that in itself makes them a charlatan. They should be stoned.
Yes.
And so my thought is like, so I asked my friends, like, so you still listen to that guy? You're still talking to that guy? You're still following him because he obviously was. Well, he was. It was a stolen. The true. And I'm like, bruh, like let it go, man. Let it go. It's okay. It's okay. Anyway, those are my brief two thoughts on that.
No, that's good. Yeah, I don't, they're not repenting. And this is why, if you put this historically, the fall of Jerusalem is just a few decades off away. And so, yeah, I mean, so they don't get it. I mean, and you have to remember that Micah and Isaiah are about the same time.
Yeah.
And once you get to the next century, I mean, you've got a series of prophets like Zephaniah. I mean, they're just scathing, about the same society. Um, and
I mean,
here's the thing: if they have priests and prophets telling them what they want to hear,
yeah.
they have this one guy who says they're all wrong, but the ones they like to hear actually say that they are being blessed by God. Who do they go with? I mean, it's kind of like
Sure.
Micaiah in 1 Kings 22, where you know Ahab, and Jehoshaphat's there,
Oh, right.
and he wants to go to battle, and so Jehoshaphat goes, "Well, is there a prophet? Because you need to have God say okay." Well, there's 400 prophets that are saying, "Yes, God is with you. Go to war." And then so Jehoshaphat kind of gets this is a bit too easy, so he says, "Is there not another prophet?" And then the king says, "Well, there is one guy who always preaches negative against me." Right. And so he's in prison. So they bring him out, and sure enough, he mocks the king. And so the false prophet comes over and slaps him across the face. And he says, who are you to say that the Spirit of God has left me and has gone to you? So I mean, even they are self-deceived.
Hmm.
But if you're a regular, Israelite, and you're watching this scene and you have 400 yes and one nay, it seems like the 400 makes more sense,
Yep.
especially if the 400 kind of have this nationalist impulse. Well, let's go on. So Herb, this is where you see that, you know, how they've responded. And then you get in verse 9, listen, the Lord is calling to the city to fear your name is wisdom, because they don't get it. Heed the rod and the one who appointed it. Am I still to forget, O wicked house, your ill-gotten treasures? And the short ephah was a measure, which is accursed. Shall I acquit a man with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? Her rich men are violent, her people are liars, and their tongues speak deceitfully. See, this thing is it's rotten to the core. And religion is all tied up in it. Let's go to chapter 7. Let's go to verse 2. The godly have been swept away from the land. Not one upright man remains. And there it is. All men lie in wait to shed blood. Each hunts his brother with a net. And both hands are skilled in doing evil. The ruler demands gifts. The judge accepts bribes. We've seen that back in chapter 3. The powerful dictate what they desire. See, they have the power to do what they want to do. And they all conspire together. See? It's the system, we would say today. It's the system where everyone's got a hand in the pot. Everyone's got, a lever to pull. Everyone's benefiting somehow from all of this. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright, worse than a thorn hedge. The day of your watchman has come, the day God visits you. Now is the time of confusion. And in the Old Testament, sometimes you want God to visit you and sometimes you don't. And here you don't. Because when God visits, it won't be, oh, happy day kind of thing. Verse 5, don't trust a neighbor. Put no confidence in a friend. I mean, that's how it's just, everyone's out for themselves. Even with her who lies in your embrace, be careful of your words. For a son dishonors his father, a daughter rises up against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the members of his own household. But as for me, the prophet, I watch in hope for the Lord. I wait for God, my Savior. My God will hear me. So if you remember earlier in the book, God will not hear all those religious leaders, but he will hear this prophet. The prophet is being very honest about what's out there. He's being very open about it. You get the sense, because earlier there in verse 2, he says, there's no good people anymore, but he's still kind of standing up. So, kind of a bleak picture. But here in verse 7, he talks about hope. Now, you have to remember that this book is talking about a coming judgment. So I don't think he sees hope that Judah will escape judgment. The hope is somehow God will not abandon them. And on the other side of judgment, he still will be there. And that he will help them through the judgment. But it doesn't seem, and the other prophets would echo this, that there is any way of avoiding the judgment. They're beyond repentance. But he does have these hope passages. So let's just look at those. And chapter 4 echoes Isaiah chapter 2, but it adds a line that's important. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established, a chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. So he will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now, in the context of the book, this is an odd kind of thing because there is no way that either Judah or Jerusalem are an example to the world. It's a very sick, cancer-filled society. So in the future, though, it'll change. In the future, this cancerous body that needs to die will rise in glory, and the nations will see it, and they will come to actually learn from them, whereas before they would have been a mockery. And he will judge between many peoples and settle disputes for strong nations far and wide, and they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore, which is what we're seeing all around the world. The world invests trillions of dollars in weaponry and in violence, let alone the violence within each country's borders. But one day that will end. And every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree. Again, put that against chapter 2, where no one has any assurance that they can even hold on to their property. But in verse 4, not only will you hold on to your property, it'll be a time of abundance and peace under your own fig tree. You will enjoy the blessings of your own crops. And no one will make them afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of other people in our society, let alone afraid of attacking nations. For the Lord Almighty has spoken. And all the nations may walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord, our God, forever and ever. This is the hope, see, of a transformed world post-judgment, where Jerusalem will not be a city built on blood, but a city from which will go out the law of the Lord. Chapter 7, at the end of the book. Who is a God like you? Okay. And this is what even Micah's name means. What is God like? That's the meaning of his name. Who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance. Okay, look at what he says. He doesn't say forgives his inheritance, the remnant, those who remain after the judgment. These are the ones with which he will rebuild. You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. And you will again have compassion on us. And you will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. And you will be true to Jacob and show mercy to Abraham, as you pledged an oath to our fathers in days long ago. And coincidentally, this kind of echoes that Exodus 2 passage, where he remembered his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here he repeats that same thing, and that's the hope. So all these prophets speak very clearly and directly about what they see. They condemn it, and they announce judgment. But on the other side of judgment, of course, there is restoration. And this is where we would tie in the coming of Jesus as the beginning of the response to all that. So I don't have time because it's already 8:15, but in this PowerPoint, there's several other passages that people might want to look at that are full of social issues as well.
You know, as you were reading that segment in chapter 4, there's such a strong resonance of Mary and the Magnificat in there. And there's a version called the Canticle of the Turning, which is a Celtic iteration song of Mary's prayer. And it's so full of this language And I thought, oh, like it's hopeful, but it's strong. It's battle, but it's hopeful.
And it's realistic. And what you find with the Magnificat, it's really Hannah's song.
Mm.
And so even that song is as old as time. Um, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can just see how the Old Testament sets up the new, but you have to reorient your way of thinking about life and God and worship and the mission of the people of God. It just gets reoriented. You can see how far off we are.
I want to describe a moment that was so informed by your teaching, and then ask a question. So I was speaking with someone, and the conversation just happened to go into the Old Testament. And so I had a moment of excitement, because I was like, guess what? And referring to the anger of God in the Old Testament, and how much it reveals his heart for the good and beautiful and the vulnerable. And then the person responded with, well, most of his anger is about idolatry, as if it was a counter. And in that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not Danny Carroll. But and the moment really didn't allow for the unpacking. But what I wanted to say is, but that's the point. It's the idolatry of a false god, of a god that it isn't this hearted God, this who seeks the flourishing of all. So it was such a classic moment of kind of the dialectic in some ways between a certain interpretation of the Old Testament and then the gift that you've given us in this class.
Right.
And then my question is,
I was going to ask. No, you ask it.
oh wait, Herb, you're gone. Where are you?
I'm here.
Did we lose your video?
Maybe I got
No,
thrown.
no, you're here.
Okay. For some
Okay.
reason, I haven't seen you.
Are you going to ask the same question I was going to ask? You got a different question.
Ask your question.
Okay, so this is well, no, Christine, is a great question.
You ask it. You ask it.
Okay.
It's
So
not-
this
Danny
language of-
said it
what?
a little. Danny sort of said it, but I think like the direct focus would be great.
Okay, so with this explicit language of mercy after the strength of judgment, how would you summarize the Old Testament's balanced explanation between justice and mercy for us and for our society? And the reason I'm asking that is twofold. One, because Christine told me to ask it. And secondly, because we were on a walk last week and my daughter was FaceTiming me, and she is trying to decide if she wants to deconstruct her faith. And she brought up Noah and him killing all the people except for Noah and his family. She's like, I don't know if I want to worship that kind of God who would, so you have justice and you have mercy. You have this mercy he's extending to Noah and his son-in-law and his daughters. At the same time, you see this, at least in my mind, it's justice because they were wicked. So how do you, there you go. So I didn't know how to answer a question. And so I left it open, hoping that we could come back and revisit an answer to that. So.
Well, let me give you a short answer of several parts. I mean, the first thing to say is that this kind of question has been around since the beginning. I mean, so she's not the first one to ask that question. The second thing that I would say is the deeper question is, in my mind, does God judge? Like, does God judge what Russia has done to Ukraine? What does that look like? Not only killing tens of thousands of Ukrainians destroying cities. We think 350,000 of their own men are dead or wounded, incapacitated, let alone all the torture and suppression of different viewpoints in Russia, the gulags and all of that. Does God judge that? I mean, does God judge centuries of slavery in this country? Does God judge all the things, the drugs, the abortions, the abuse of women and children, the violence on the streets, our complicity in wars? Does God judge what we've done to the planet? What kind of God do you want? Do you want a God who will judge the evil of the world or not? And if you do, what does that look like? Now, Genesis will say the world was full of violence. I mean, it says that in chapter 6. And God lets a lot of violence go for a long time. What would you do with the Holocaust? What do you do with the invasion of Poland and Czechoslovakia and France and North Africa? I mean, what do you do, with all that? And if you say, well, God, I don't want a God to judge. Well, what kind of God do you want? What kind of God is that? That God offers no hope to the poor and vulnerable of this country. It offers no hope to sex slavery. It offers no hope to the drug, people suffering from drug dealers. And you give no one any hope, because basically you want a hands-off kind of God that lets it go. And God takes it so seriously that he steps into history. Now, the thing that, I think sometimes the question's just all wrong. Then you'll say, well, a lot of innocent people die. Well, in some ways, yes. But even that's more complicated. So let's go back to the slavery thing in this country. Let's say post-Civil War, where you have millions of Southerners who may not be participating actively in lynching, but they actively participate in a very segregationist, cruel society, and will justify all of what they do. And they raise their children in this, and they perpetuate it in all kinds of ways. Does that deserve judgment? All the grief, all the death and marginalization that they've caused, to African Americans. I mean, what do you want to do with that? I mean, so you've got to have a God of judgment to make any sense of the world and give anybody any hope. So you've changed the discussion, you see. And the last part of it is, and I'm kind of close here because I know the game's just starting upstairs, because I can hear Joan, my wife. Jesus will actually take upon himself the brutality of the violence of the world. I mean, he will actually be brutalized by the authorities. And the thing that's amazing about that God not only judges, but even on the cross, he will say, Father, forgive them, they do not know what they do. But they did, but they didn't. You see, they knew what they were doing. They were getting paid for it. But they were so blinded by their own sin, they couldn't see it. And that's the reality of the world. I mean, the sin of the world enslaves us, and we don't even see it. And so and so what I would tell your daughter is that question is as old as time. I mean, and they're even the disciples are asking about this. this tower had fallen on these innocent people. He says, was this because of the sins of their parents? If you remember that gospel passage. And he says, no. So it's the, you're entering to a mystery, but if you don't have judgment, I don't know what kind of hope you have to offer anybody. Because now we're just left to our, basically it's the strong survive.
Yeah. And if that's the case, then we want to make sure they're the strongest possible. So we want them to be as comfortable as possible right now, make sure they have all the resources at hand so they can weather the incoming storm, because really it's up to them to protect themselves, because there is no God who can render judgment.
Yeah. And the only way you do that is by taking advantage of other people.
Yep, 100%.
All right. We want to get you to the game, but
okay. We'll
I
see.
well, just want to say that I don't think I've ever heard this. A God of judgment gives hope.
Yeah. There is no hope without judgment. There can't
That's
be.
beautiful. So, Lord God, thank you for being a God of hope and that justice is a thing and you delight in showing mercy. Bless everyone on this call. Thank you for Herb and his life. Thank you for Danny and Joan. And this evening, what a gift of Micah, who is asking, who are you, God? We want to know you. Amen.